In fact, you have to say that women are not subservient chattel, as is the case in the Old Testament and in many religious documents. And if not to just offend Judeo-Christian religious sensibilities, the Kennewick man was not an Umatilla Indian. Okay? And it was an offense to me when the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers held onto that skeleton. If you don't know, this was a 9,000-year-old skeleton that was discovered in the Columbia River on Umatilla Indian land. And it was interesting because it was claimed that this skeleton had Caucasian features. In fact, if you put skin on him, he'd look somewhat like Patrick Stewart. And it was a fascinating question. But for many years, scientists weren't allowed to study the skeleton because the Umatilla Indians said, this is on our land, and therefore it's one of our ancestors, and we believe the Earth is 5,000 years old, and this is 9,000 years old, and we want to keep this for ourselves. And it's just ludicrous, in fact. And the Kennewick man had much genetic relationship to an Umatilla Indian as they did to me, and it's ridiculous to respect those kind of nonsensical sensibilities. And we have to emphasize that these documents are historical documents. So we can enrich faith by pointing out what's nonsense. But in particular, I spend a lot of time talking to scientists about teaching. And this, I believe, is the biggest mistake that any teacher can make, which is to assume the students are interested in what they have to say. It sounds trite, but it's absolutely true. You have to sell. Teaching is selling. And science is selling. And it's, in fact, it's seduction. If you want to educate people, you have to go to where they are and reach out to where they're coming from. And if you want to educate people, attacking them is not going to educate them at all. And I think most of us here, I think Steve and I would certainly agree that what we want to do is educate. We want to explain to people the wonders of nature. But if we want to make them receptive to it, we have to understand where they're coming from. In fact, I decided to quote someone else. In this case, I quoted myself. This was a review of mine of Richard Dawkins' book that just came out. And my review just came out in Nature. And I think that's true. I think that the strategy of focusing on telling people what not to believe is less compelling than positively demonstrating how the wonders of nature can suggest a world without God that is nevertheless both complete and wonderful. If you believe that and want to convince people of that, focus on what is so incredible and marvelous and fantastic about the universe, and not on what people shouldn't believe in. And in fact, in this sense, I think scientists have responsibility. And scientists and physicists are the worst. I think we're the most obnoxious of the bunch, potentially. But because well, anyway.
No, biologists.
Yeah, I knew you were going to say that. But science has been so successful, I think many scientists act like, we know what's good for you, and we're going to explain what's good for you. And that approach immediately turns people off, and in fact is, in my mind, responsible for a lot of the public reaction against science. Not just the fear that science will undermine their belief system, but the fact that scientists are claiming that that basically people are stupid, and that we can tell you what to believe. And I happen to think that is not, it actually demeans science as well as demeaning religion. That, in fact, science does not encompass the entirety of human intellectual experience, and we can't pretend it does. And there are things of vital importance to people that have nothing to do with rationality. And they're profoundly important in a large part of people's lives, and to ignore that is to demean those people, but as I say, to demean science. And people have said, and in fact, I think maybe the Cardinal may have even talked about scientism. It's a recent word, but I think it's probably worth approaching. That when scientists, and I can say, for me, there's no evidence whatsoever of design or purpose in the universe based on my study of cosmology. That's a fine scientific statement for me to say. But for me to say, therefore there was no design or purpose, that's a metaphysical statement or a philosophical statement that I'm entitled to make, but I'm not being a scientist when I'm making it. And I think we have to recognize that it's beyond the limits of science to go that far. And in fact, as I just say there, and in fact, to Andy Druins here, to quote Carl Sagan, the absence of evidence is not evidence for absence. And he applied it in that case to aliens, I suppose, or something. But it's true. The fact that there's no evidence for design or purpose in the universe is not the same as saying there's no design or purpose. I think the latter statement is a philosophical statement. And actually, Richard Dawkins begins his new book with a quote from Thomas Jefferson, which I like a lot, where he said, "I'm satisfied and sufficiently occupied with the things which are, without tormenting or troubling myself about those which may indeed be, but which I have no evidence. Steve put it another way, which I think is equally true. Most scientists don't think enough about God to even call themselves atheists. It's not a question that arises. Why should we trouble ourselves with that? We should trouble ourselves, in fact, with doing science. And here's a statement from the International Theological Commission, a statement actually at the time when Pope Benedict was then a cardinal and head of that commission. And as he stated at the time, as they stated in the time, they had no problem with evolution because God is the cause of all causes. As a result, through the activity of natural causes, God causes to arise those conditions required for the emergence and support of living organisms, and furthermore for the reproduction and differentiation. A statement where the Theological Commission actually said, as they called contingent phenomena, purely random phenomena, are perfectly in accord with Catholic theology. There's no way that I can see that science can disprove that kind of statement, and it's a waste of time, it seems to me, to try. And totally non-productive. What we should focus on, it seems to me, is the fact that the universe is a remarkable place without all the junk. That only when we're willing to accept the universe for what it is, without fear, will we be able to build a just society. This we'll get on to later tomorrow. Science, we should focus on the fact that science isn't a threat to a moral world. That science has an ethos. And the ethos of science is actually pretty good. It's based on honesty, open-mindedness, creativity, egalitarianism, I would put it as anti-authoritarianism, and full disclosure. If any of these things were common, say in Washington right now, the world would be a better place. And the fundamental thing about science is that it works. And that's what's really important to stress, is that it leads to, in many ways, a better world. It works. It allows us to describe and, in some sense, control the world. And we should recognize that and use that fact. When President Bush said both sides should be taught when it comes to intelligent design evolution, well, that wasn't an intrinsically stupid statement, surprisingly. If there were two sides, it's a perfectly appropriate statement. It represented ignorance. There aren't two sides to that scientific argument. But it's amazing, when the avian flu was developed, President Bush immediately said, well, we have to immediately start working about how long it's going to take to mutate and migrate to humans. You didn't see anyone saying, well, it's been designed to kill us. Forget it, you know. Immediately, when there's a problem, people turn to science. And that's what we should be focusing on, the fact that what science can do. And when people talk about family values, we should focus on the fact that the real family values are owing our children the best science preparation, the best education we can give them, so they can compete in the 21st century that's going to depend on our future on science and technology. And finally, I think, I'll just leave it, we should focus on the fact that mysteries, that not knowing is actually a good thing, that not knowing is wonderful, that you don't have to know everything, and the mysteries that science explores are probably the best. And so I'll leave it with the other hero, Albert Einstein, who said, the fairest thing we can experience is the mysterious. It's the fundamental emotion that stands at the cradle of true art and true science. And it's the mysterious, I think, and our fascination with the world, which scientists can use to, instead of attack religion, I think encourage people of faith to understand the world that actually is, rather than the world that they would like it to be. Thank you.
Thanks, Larry. I don't know if there's anything, Steve, is there anything you want to respond to briefly there? I do remember yesterday you mentioned that you kept running into people who somehow were able to hold these opposing things in their mind. There was an oil man in Texas who...
Yeah, so this is a second-hand story that a friend of mine met an oil man in Texas who believed that the earth was 6,000 years old, because that's what's taught in the book of Genesis, and also believed that the deposits of oil in the Permian Basin were 50 million years old, because that's what you need to know in order to explore for petroleum. And somehow or other he managed this, a feat of intellectual acrobatics that I can only admire. Well, I should say, since Larry mentioned that the question of teaching evolution in the schools will come to Texas, of course it already has, and I testified in front of the Texas school board, who has the responsibility of choosing textbooks for the whole state. And some of them were in favor of bringing intelligent design into the textbooks, and others were opposed to it.